Hello and welcome to the David Clank Furniture channel. This week is episode 3 of making the large jewelry box, and this video is going to be about hand-cut dovetails. This is a box that I've made with the dovetails, and that is what we're going to be talking about this week. How to make these, what is necessary to have in order to make them, and how to get high quality dovetails in a very reliable way. These are the tools that I use for laying out and cutting the dovetails. The place to start, I think, is with the Moxon vise here in the front. This is handmade, but it's about 28 inches long, about 3 inches tall. I'll go into more detail about this later, but this works great at holding the pieces for laying out and cutting the dovetails. In addition to the vise, I have scribe. We'll talk about that. I'm going to go through these individually. I just want to do a quick overview right now. A scribe, a layout stick, story pole, 6-inch ruler, mechanical pencils. This is a brass angle iron that I filed to the right angle. I use about a 7.5 degree angle. It's just something that I liked, so that's what I stuck with. Different hand saws. I've got a Japanese saw and a Western saw. Most of the time I use the Western saw, but I'll show using both. Squares, a level to make sure that the workpiece is straight. Chisels, I'll talk about that more in a minute. Angle gauge is really useful. Fret saws. This is a sample of dovetails. If you've never used optivisors, and depending how old you are, those come in real handy. A tape measure. That's the overview. Now I'll go through one at a time in more detail about the different tools. The vise is handmade, and it has some features that I want to go over with you so that you understand why it is the way it is. The first thing is that it's about 27 inches long in total, but between the posts here that hold the vise together, it's about 17 inches, which is more than enough for anything that I will be doing. Why I made this the way I made it is because I didn't like the idea of having big cranks coming out from the front so it doesn't catch on your clothes. I make these square so it's easier to get leverage to turn them, but also so that if you see that both the end grain are up on both handles, then you know that the jaw is parallel to the back jaw. Also, it's easy to have something that's fairly light that I can put up on a shelf. It's not too deep front to back, so it'll stay out of the way except for when I need it. Can bring it out. The braces are pulled back from the end, so there's room to put the clamps, and it works really well. I've had it for years now, and it's been just wonderful. This front jaw is made up of 2 pieces of white oak, and so it's got some flex, but it stays true. It doesn't twist. It's always been just the best thing since making it. Before that, I just used my vise, and I'm going to go in there and show you that and show you the difference between using the regular Scandinavian style woodworking bench and using this for cutting dovetails. This is the vise, my woodworking bench. This is the piece of poplar that's going to be used for the mock-ups for the jewelry boxes. Before I made the Moxon vise, I would slide this in here, and you can see it's not too bad for something this size, but it's off center with the screw, and so this side is never as tight as this side. And as you saw, you noticed that, and when you saw a lot of things, it gets to be annoying. So that's why I made the Moxon vise and why I use it for doing dovetails. But now we'll go back into the other bench. To start laying out and cutting the dovetails, I usually begin with the pins. I have the pins on the front and back pieces of the jewelry box. I can explain, and I will as time goes on, the reasons why I do things the way I do, but for right now, I'm going to go through a quick overview of how I do things. And then as I demonstrate doing them, I'll talk about why I do it the way I do. The first step is to scribe a line that is the thickness of the side pieces, that'll be the tails, on the front and back, which will be the pins. These are examples of a different box, just a layout that I did. These are the pins. This will be the front and back of the boxes. These are the sides, which are the tails. I cut a shallow 1/16 rabbet on the side pieces so that when they go together, any little gap where the pins are cut, the tail cut for the pins to slide through, sometimes those end up on the inside being a little bit bigger, and I don't want those to show. So that's why I cut that rabbet. It's very common. Almost everybody does it that way. So the reason I say that is that that rabbet has to be cut first. And the space of the scribe has to be fitted to that thickness. And it's not done like from measuring. You have to measure from the actual cut. So I'm going to cut that rabbet now. This is the mock-up box that I'll be using to do all the setups, layouts, any little practice that I need to do. I'll be doing it on this box before I run the batch. Also, this is what I'm going to use to demonstrate with. I'll try to show some work being done with the other boxes, but most of the videos are going to be me showing the work in the poplar. So we have the front, the back, and the sides. The sides are going to get rabbeted. In order to get a really clean cut, I did a scribe line on the inside edge of the sides. What I'm going to do now, set up the table saw, make a cut with the workpiece in this orientation, and then that will cut the shoulder, and then there'll be a second cut where I go that way, where I remove the waist. After I cut the rabbit, I take a sanding stick and I just clean up the fuzz. I've already done this one to lay out and demonstrate, and I want to show you that. So that's what it looks like, and that's ready for the box. This part is what we're going to scribe onto the pins, and this is just over 9/16. That's around 14 millimeters. So we're going to set gauge distance from the cutter to the edge at just a little bit more than that. So maybe 19/30 seconds, or I don't know, 14.5 millimeters. I want to talk a little bit about this scribe. These pins are phonograph needles, and you can buy them on Etsy or eBay or Amazon, and you can get a bunch of them for less than $5. One of the critical parts of this whole thing is to get that point sharpened to a knife edge, if I can show it, rather than a conical point like the phonograph needle needs to be. And I'll go into that in a separate video, but that's critical. And I want to show just one thing. If this is a piece of scrap that I'll be doing some of the demonstrations with. When you slice that line with a sharp scribe, it sounds like this. And it looks like this. It's a clean, sharp line. It's not ragged. None of the fibers are torn. And that becomes critically important as this whole thing goes forward. This is the story pole, or the layout stick, and it shows where the tenons are, or the pins are going to go. This wide section is a very large pin in the beginning here in the box. Where the X's are is where the saw kerf is, where the lid is separated from the box. This is the outside surface of the front of the box. And so I'm going to start by making a line laying out the narrowest part of the pins on the outside edge. It runs a little bit long just in case some of the pieces are longer. It's always referenced off the top. Now, with what I like about this layout is that the vertical line and the line going across the top of the box, or the pin, is automatically in one place. And the same on this side. Once you line up the corner with your pencil line, you get lines that line up well. So those are the pins. I have them about 3/16 of an inch wide and spaced between, for the bottom of the box, there's 2 evenly spaced. For the top of the box, there's just the one that meets the regular box, and then the lid. This area goes under the frame and panel lid that fits in it. This shouldn't be angled. I'm going to change that right now. That will get, if I cut it on the angle, it gets shaved away when I cut the rabbet for the frame and panel lid. So that's a square. That's what it should look like. This gets cut on a miter, but the rest of these get cut away. Put the X on the waist so that you don't have to erase a bunch of pencil lines when you are done cutting. So I'm just going to show that real quick on this side. That's how that looks. Now there's nothing left to do but cut the lines. I don't cut right on the lines. I don't make a scribe line because I'll be using a piece of sandpaper on a stick to dial it in back to exactly where the line is. I measure these with calipers to get them all within a very small amount of consistency. I'll be using the Distin Western saw and showing you how I cut these. It's better to leave a space between the bottom of the kerf and the scribe line than it is to go, once you go over the line, that's going to be noticeable. So those are the cuts. That's pretty much how I do it. If I had 10 boxes, I would do all of these cuts. It's easy to see that this one it's really bad. That's why I come back later. And now the next step is to trim the waist. That can be done, or I do that with a fret saw. There's 2 ways of doing it. This fret saw, if I can show this, has the blades so that the teeth are horizontal. You can put it down in the cut. And the problem with using the fret saw is to go, if you go past the line, there's no saving it. You have to do it over. So I pull it up at least 1/8 inch because you have to pare that shoulder anyway. one of the things that can go wrong is you can cut into this pin before you cut through the back. So when I get close, I break it out. The way I'm doing it more recently is to use this large fret saw, and it just has a longer reach and a very dull blade. You can hear it as it gets closer. You can just break it off. And I'll cut these last two, and then I'm going to flip the board around and cut the miter. So now what I'm cutting is I'm cutting away down to this line, to that line, and then cutting away that part next. I'll cut this away when I'm in at the other bench. It's important that I don't cut through the front. This is the back of the front piece. This is the front, and if I nick down past that edge, that will show in the finished box. And that's it. Now we'll go into the other bench room and I'll show chopping the shoulders. We're back in the bench room at the other workbench. I've got the board clamped against the bench. This surface is perfectly square. The workpiece, the outside face is down. I start on the inside, then I cut halfway through, I flip it over and go from the other way. And when I'm finishing, I want to be looking at the outside surface of the workpiece, what would be the front of the box, to make sure that where the two cuts meet, that the outside edge is not set back a tiny bit from the inside edge. It's hard to explain. I'll explain it when I flip it over. But the most common problem that people have when they're chopping the shoulders is if your chisels aren't razor sharp, then the wood crumbles and it breaks away, and people call them craters. So if you take a really large chisel, and I've got this surface is aligned with the scribe line, and you put it in there and you tap it, that works fine. But where you have a little bit more waste and you go at it this way, sometimes that waste breaks, it shears instead of being cut, and it breaks behind the line, and then you get these gaps and things, and it just looks really ragged, and little pieces can be broken off. When you try to assemble things, there's a problem. So I come in with a carving tool. This is about a number 4 gouge sweep, or a number 5 gouge sweep. This is an old Addis I got from eBay. And that removes the waste, but you see it's just a minimal amount of grain disruption, and maybe I went a little bit too hard with that. But if you come in and do that, that removes the waste in a way that allows you to get these clean end grain surfaces. So I think of this as like a shovel, and these other chisels are like a rake. And what you are left with is a really smooth surface that works better once you get to assembly. And I'm just going to work through these now. You come down. Then you pare in to remove the waste. And that's it. You can see a tiny little bit of grain disruption, but really nothing major. And I'm just going to work through that, and then I'll bring the camera back on when I flip it over. This is the outside surface of the front of the box, getting the edge right over the scribe line. I have a piece of masonite. That's what you see, the white surface here is a piece of masonite to protect the top of the bench. Now, what happens when you chop down from the top is that this last little bit of waste is going to leverage and break out the grain. And so you'll see a line there where that happens. I'm going to go with another gouge, trying to clean up the waste as much as I can before I go with the paring chisels. But by taking it away with the gouge, there's less breakout than if I had just gone through with the bench chisels. And now I use a fairly narrow bench chisel because there'll be less breakout and you can get more of a shearing action. And that's what I do next. And that's cutting the shoulder. I'm going to zoom in. And you can see I need a little bit of work on the pins. That's why I do the pins first, because there's more room for the chisels to move around between them. So I can come in and clean all that up. And that's going to be next. The last step before I pare the pins is to remove this piece of waste where the miter for the top of the box and then the frame and panel lid sits down in a rabbet that hasn't been cut yet. But I have to cut that. And that's what I'll do now. Back at the Moxon vise, and we have the pins cut and we've chopped the shoulders, and now the next thing to do is to get everything parallel, square, and make sure that these inside surfaces are just relieved a little bit to reduce the friction when we push things together. I'm going to show a close-up. You can see this one needs to be pulled back to the line. That one's right on the line. And this is pretty common. You can see a little bit of the grain disruption that happens when you chop. That one's a little bit worse. So here we are back at the Moxon vise. I have the inside surface of the jewelry box front piece facing out where I'll work on it. I'm going to set the camera up on the back side so that I'm not in the way when I try to demonstrate this stuff. All we're doing now is pairing those surfaces. I'm going to focus on pairing this pin, both sides of this. There's a couple ways of doing it. You can come in with a chisel that's wider than the pin and push down. The problem with that is that it's really hard to keep it going straight, especially with bird's eye and the curly woods. There's a tendency for it to follow the grain. It's hard to control, and once you get started, you really can't stop. The second way is to come in this way and pair this out and pair back to the line, and that's what I did for years. It works pretty well. It allows you to put a tiny little bit of effort into cutting away a little recess here, so there's not as much friction. But honestly, for the last several years, I've been using more of a hybrid approach, where I come in with the chisels or with the knife. And with the knife, I'm just removing the stuff in the corner, and then I'm coming in with what I guess you'd call an emery board, and just working this so that I have the board up in the pin. If the pin is tapered and you sand it, it's going to be more tapered. The board has no sandpaper on this edge, so I'm not grinding into that bottom surface. What I'm doing is just dialing it in and getting it to the line. Once I do that, I come in with a chisel, relieve a little bit in here, and that's pretty much it. Clean this up. So I'm pretty far off the line back here. So I pair that. To get pretty close to the line, and you can see the pin is narrower at the top than the bottom. That will split the sides. So I'll come in and just, because the grain's really straight, I can save a lot of time by paring that back. Coming in with a knife. Then coming in with the emery board. The risk with the emery board is that the pin will become rounded like this, and so it's important to be able to come back and just make sure that the line is straight. And the way to test is just to put a chisel in there. It should be flat across the top and flat vertically. To know that you have it right, we're going to check it with a square, and I'm going to do that right now. This is an adjustable square, and what this is for is coming in and testing this. You can see there's just a little bit. It's pretty good, a little bit of daylight there. This pin's still a little bit too fat, so I'll come in I have the workpiece flipped around again so we can look at it from this side. We're talking about this pin. What I want to do is show you this trick of holding a rule up against it to look for any gaps, and there's some tiny little gaps. I'm going to try to focus in on that. And so that what I'm working on is pairing this area in here and cleaning up this area here. I'm going to do that with a piece of, I think, like 220 grit on a stick, and just get in there and do that. I can't do that with the camera in the way, but just that's all it takes. I'm going to clean up this area here, and it's pretty much the same thing. I have to move the camera in order to get at that, but the goal is to just work on the surfaces of the pins until they're all perpendicular, parallel to the other side of the pin, and I've got good angles, I've got good, the size of the pins are equal, and I'll bring the camera back once I have that done. Okay, so what I've done is try to set up the lighting so that you can see the pins here have been relieved just a tiny bit. The edges of the pins that are going to be exposed, the front and the top. So that would be the front of the jewelry box and going back on the side. These are parallel. This pin and this pin are the same width. This bottom pin's a little bit more because we'll need to even it up a little bit when we glue things together. There may be a misalignment between the side and the front, so we'll shave that down a little bit. And it also looks better if the bottom pin's a little bit thicker. You can take the ruler and align it, and you can see that there's no spaces here, that those are aligned. Same with this one, hard to see with the camera angle, but with that you can see that things are aligned. The next step is to transfer these pins onto the side piece, cut the sides and get things fitted. This video is running really long. I'm going to put that rest of it off to another video, and I hope to get this edited and up real quick and get the next one up very quickly also. Thank you.